Actually, the first show that I played was the Ohio State Fair with about 20,000 people, and I was extremely frightened.
Ricky Nelson was one of the brightest stars in American entertainment, a child icon who grew into a chart-topping musician, a TV favorite, and a symbol of effortless cool. But behind the clean-cut smile and the smooth voice that made millions fall in love, Ricky carried a private world of pressure, heartbreak, and secrets that few ever truly understood. And now, after all these years, new details have surfaced. Details so unexpected, so deeply personal, that even Hollywood insiders are stunned. These revelations cast Ricky's life in a completely different light, exposing hidden struggles and emotional battles that were quietly shaping him long before his tragic final flight. Fans always believed they knew the real Ricky Nelson. After all, he practically grew up in their living rooms, living out his childhood on national television. But the truth is far more complicated. Behind the scenes, Ricky wrestled with burdens that would have broken anyone else. The crushing expectations of fame, the changing tides of the music industry, and a private life filled with difficult choices and lingering pain. And only now are some of the people closest to him finally revealing what he endured. These are stories that were never shared publicly, stories that explain the exhaustion in his eyes during his later years and the silent determination that kept him moving forward. These new details don't just reshape Ricky Nelson's legacy, they reveal the human behind the legend. What really happened in his final months? Who was trying to protect him? And what truths was Ricky carrying alone? The answers are heartbreaking and long overdue. Ricky Nelson's life has often been told like a polished Hollywood story. The charming boy next door who grew up on television, turned into a teenage heartthrob, and then transformed himself into a respected musician in an ever-changing industry. But the reality behind that polished image was far more complex, and many of the people closest to Ricky say he spent most of his life trying to escape a spotlight that he never asked for in the first place. From the very beginning, Ricky was a child living under an enormous weight, pressured to maintain a perfect public image while quietly fighting private battles that most fans never suspected. Even as a young boy, Ricky felt the strain of expectations. While millions tuned in every week to watch him and his family on television, Ricky often confided to friends that he felt trapped, expected to smile on cue, follow scripts, and maintain an image that didn't match who he really was. This early pressure shaped the rest of his life. It taught him to hide his emotions, to push down his frustrations, and to perform even when he felt overwhelmed. Hollywood adored him, but few understood the toll that adoration took. As he grew older, Ricky discovered that fame, which had once seemed like a blessing, often became a burden. The music industry evolved rapidly, audiences changed, and the sound he helped define was suddenly considered old-fashioned. Ricky refused to abandon his artistic identity, but the struggle to stay relevant weighed on him. Behind every performance, every interview, and every new album was a quiet fear that he was being left behind by an industry he helped shape. Those closest to him say Ricky worked harder than ever during those years, fighting to prove that he still had something meaningful to offer. But the most heartbreaking revelations come from the people who traveled with Ricky, shared the stage with him, and witnessed his emotional exhaustion firsthand. They speak of nights when Ricky would finish a high-energy show, flash a grateful smile to the audience, and then retreat backstage with a heaviness that no one could ignore. He wasn't unhappy with the fans, he loved them deeply, but the pressure to deliver perfection every night, combined with the uncertainties surrounding his career, often left him emotionally drained. He was a man carrying expectations larger than anyone around him truly realized. In the months leading up to the tragic plane crash that ended his life, Ricky's inner circle noticed a shift. Some say he seemed more reflective, more determined, to rebuild areas of his life that had been strained for years. He spent more time connecting with his family, more time reconsidering the direction of his career, and more time confronting the emotional wounds he had long kept buried. These new details paint a picture of a man on the verge of a turning point, someone who had endured years of pressure yet was finally beginning to reclaim his sense of purpose. But there were also warning signs. Ricky's schedule had become more demanding, with long travel days, constant performances, and the relentless grind of touring. Friends later admitted they worried about how exhausted he looked, but Ricky always insisted he could handle it. He had been under pressure his entire life. Pushing through felt normal. Yet the emotional weight he carried, combined with years of physical stress, was taking a toll even he didn't fully acknowledge. These newly revealed insights show a man who was far stronger than most people ever realized. A man who fought quietly, loved deeply, and worked tirelessly to live up to expectations placed on him since childhood. Ricky Nelson was more than a star. He was someone trying desperately to balance the demands of fame with the longing for a life that felt genuinely his own. And as these new details continue to emerge, they force Hollywood to confront a painful truth. Behind the legend was a human being who deserved far more understanding, compassion, and peace than he ever received. As more people from Ricky Nelson's inner circle come forward, a clearer picture of his final years has begun to emerge. One filled not only with pressure, but with moments of profound loneliness that he worked hard to hide from the world. Ricky was surrounded by crowds, adored by audiences, and recognized almost everywhere he went. Yet those closest to him say he often felt isolated. The cheerful stage persona that fans admired did not always reflect the emotional storms he was fighting privately, especially as he grew older and more reflective. One of the most surprising revelations came from a musician who spent years touring with Ricky. He described how Ricky would sometimes sit quietly after a show, staring at the floor, lost in thought. When asked if something was wrong, Ricky would simply smile and say he was tired. But those who knew him best understood that the exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Ricky had been in the spotlight since he was a child, and the constant pressure to live up to his own legacy weighed heavily on him. He wasn't just performing music. He was performing a version of himself that the world expected to see. Friends now admit that Ricky struggled deeply with the changing music landscape. Younger stars were rising, new sounds dominated the charts, and the industry seemed to move on without him. For someone who once ruled the airwaves, this shift felt brutal. Ricky tried to adapt, but he never wanted to abandon the sound that defined him. His loyalty to his musical identity, though admirable, often left him feeling stuck between the past and an uncertain future. Those around him recall many late-night conversations where Ricky wondered if the industry still had a place for him. But the new details also reveal something more heartbreaking. Ricky was carrying emotional scars that went far beyond his career. People close to him spoke about personal struggles he kept deeply private, conflicts that affected his family, disappointments that weighed heavily on his heart, and emotional burdens he rarely shared. One confidant described Ricky as a man who felt everything too deeply, someone who absorbed pain quietly and rarely allowed himself the space to heal. Despite his calm and charming public appearance, Ricky was often wrestling with feelings of guilt, pressure, and unresolved grief. Those who spent time with him during his final months noticed that Ricky had become increasingly introspective. He talked more about his childhood, reflecting on the price of growing up in the public eye. He wondered whether he had ever truly been allowed to make his own choices. The new revelation suggests that Ricky was finally confronting emotional wounds he had ignored for decades. Wounds formed from living in a world where he was expected to be perfect, composed, and endlessly successful. Another detail that shocked many was just how committed Ricky had been to rebuilding parts of his life that had fallen apart over the years. Friends say he was making real progress, reconnecting with people he cared about, reevaluating his career direction, and setting personal goals that he had postponed for far too long. Those closest to him describe a man who was finally starting to reclaim his happiness, focusing on what he wanted, not what others expected. He was rediscovering the things that truly mattered: family, music he believed in, and a sense of peace he'd never fully experienced. But this period of reflection came with its own challenges. Ricky was tired, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Touring, while exciting, was draining. His schedule was packed with performances, travel, and constant obligations. Each show demanded energy he sometimes struggled to find. Friends now say they often urged him to slow down, to rest, to take care of himself. But Ricky was determined to keep pushing forward. He believed that stopping meant falling behind, and after everything he'd been through, he wasn't willing to give up. These new details reveal a side of Ricky Nelson that the world never saw. A man who was trying to heal, trying to rebuild, and trying to find himself after years of carrying burdens in silence. The tragic truth is that Ricky was on the verge of a turning point, a moment where his life could have changed. Direction. But fate intervened before he ever had the chance. As investigators and close companions revisited Ricky Nelson's final days, some of the most startling revelations emerged from the people who were with him in the last stretch of his life. The band members, friends, and crew who saw firsthand the mixture of exhaustion, determination, and quiet vulnerability that he carried during his final tour. Their accounts reveal a story far more complicated than the polished headlines that followed his tragic death, exposing a man who was fighting through mounting pressure while trying desperately to protect the people he cared. About one musician who traveled with Ricky during those final weeks described seeing a noticeable shift in him, not in his spirit, but in the way he responded to stress. Ricky had always been calm under pressure, someone who rarely snapped or complained. But as the tour progressed, he became more withdrawn. He spent more time alone in his room, resting between performances, and often kept his conversations short, even with people he trusted. It wasn't irritation, it was exhaustion, the result of years spent pushing himself to meet expectations that never seemed to lessen. Friends now say that Ricky was carrying not only emotional burdens, but physical ones as well. He had been performing constantly, traveling long distances, and juggling a schedule that would have overwhelmed even a younger, less experienced performer. He tried to hide the fatigue, but those closest to him could see it clearly. One performer recalled that Ricky often leaned against the wall backstage, closing his eyes for a few seconds just to gather enough strength for the next moment. He was doing everything he could to keep going, even when his body begged for rest. But the most heartbreaking part of these new details isn't the exhaustion. It's the way Ricky, despite everything, remained focused on the people who depended on him. He worried about his band, their income, their stability. He worried about his family, their well-being, their future. Those who spoke to him in his final days revealed that he carried a strong sense of responsibility. He felt that slowing down, cancelling shows, or stepping back would leave others struggling. Ricky had spent his whole life trying to meet expectations, and even when he was overwhelmed, he believed he had to keep putting others first. Another revelation that shocked many was the emotional weight Ricky carried from years of public scrutiny. Despite being beloved by millions, he had spent decades dealing with criticism, industry pressure, and stories that painted him in ways that didn't match who he truly was. One close friend shared that Ricky had recently opened up about feeling misunderstood, about being seen as a symbol rather than a human being. He talked about wanting to reclaim his voice, reshape his career, and show the world the person he had always been behind the spotlight. In his final days, Ricky was also thinking deeply about his music. Those around him say he was excited about new possibilities, new sounds, and new ways to reconnect with audiences. He wasn't finished, not even close. He believed he had more to share, more to create, more to say. And for the first time in a long time, he was starting to trust his instincts again. He talked about releasing new material, exploring fresh ideas, and building something that felt genuinely his own. The tragic truth, as revealed by these new details, is that Ricky was preparing for a comeback, not an ending. Yet despite his hopes, there were troubling moments that now stand out in painful clarity. Ricky was pushing himself far harder than he should have. He often brushed off concerns from friends, insisting he was fine. He kept telling them he had things under control, even when his exhaustion was obvious. Those who knew him best now admit they wish they had insisted, pushed harder, or convinced him to take even a brief break. But Ricky had always been stubborn in his dedication. A lifetime of pressure had taught him to keep going, no matter how hard things became. These newly uncovered insights make Ricky Nelson's final days even more heartbreaking. They reveal a man trying to reclaim his life, his voice, and his future, while quietly fighting battles he never shared with the world. He was on the edge of a new beginning, but he was also carrying years of weight that few ever knew existed. And as these tragic truths continue to surface, they reshape the way Hollywood remembers him, not just as a star, but as a man who deserved far more rest, understanding, and compassion than he ever received. In the years since Ricky Nelson's tragic passing, countless theories, speculations, and carefully guarded accounts have circulated. But the newest details, coming from those who stayed silent out of loyalty, respect, or lingering grief, finally reveal the emotional truth behind his final moments and the legacy he left behind. These revelations are not about scandal or blame. They are about understanding the man Ricky truly was, someone who spent his entire life giving everything he had to his craft, his loved ones, and the people who believed in him. One of the most heartbreaking insights comes from a longtime friend who recently shared that Ricky's final tour was meant to be a fresh start. He had been talking about new music, new directions, and even new collaborations that could reconnect him with audiences who had grown up admiring him. He wanted to reclaim the voice he felt had been overlooked for too long. According to this friend, Ricky believed he was finally stepping into a chapter where he could create without compromise, where he could focus on artistic joy instead of public pressure. This makes the loss even harder to accept. He was on the verge of rediscovery, not decline. Those closest to Ricky also reveal that he had been working to strengthen relationships that had been strained by years of fame, travel, and emotional weight. He was reaching out more, opening up more, and allowing himself to speak honestly about the challenges he had always kept buried. Family members now say they saw subtle changes in him. Softer reflections, more thoughtful conversations, and a desire to reconnect with the simplest parts of life. Ricky was finally letting himself feel the things he had pushed aside since childhood. And as emotional wounds began to heal, he carried a quiet hope that better days were finally coming. But the most sobering new detail involves just how overwhelming his final schedule truly was. Members of his team have described the demanding travel, the late-night performances, and the constant strain placed on Ricky's already exhausted body. Some admit they urged him to slow down, to take breaks, to allow himself even a moment's rest. Yet Ricky, shaped by decades of pressure to meet expectations and deliver perfection, kept pushing forward. He had lived his entire life believing that stopping, even for a moment, meant letting people down. And that belief may have cost him more than anyone realized at the time. Friends now look back on moments they once dismissed as ordinary. The tired smile, the quiet sigh, the long pauses between conversations, and see them differently. They now understand that Ricky was running on determination rather than strength. He didn't want anyone to worry. He didn't want to burden the people he cared about. And so, like he had done since childhood, he hid the heaviness behind a calm, gentle exterior that made others believe he was fine. One particularly emotional revelation came from someone who had spoken to Ricky just days before the crash. The friend said Ricky expressed a rare mix of exhaustion and excitement, tired from touring but hopeful about the future. He talked about wanting to take a different path, one that aligned with who he truly was, not who people expected him to be. The conversation now feels like a final glimpse into a man trying to reshape his life with whatever time he had left. As these details continue to surface, they transform Ricky Nelson's story from a simple tragedy into something far deeper. They reveal a man who never stopped trying, someone who refused to quit even when weighed down by pressures he never asked for. They show a performer who gave everything he had to the world, even when he received far too little kindness in return. And they highlight the emotional cost of a lifetime spent under a spotlight bright enough to warm, yet harsh enough to burn. Ricky Nelson's life was filled with music, passion, dedication, and quiet resilience. But these new revelations remind us that beneath the fame was a human being searching for peace, understanding, and a sense of belonging. And though his story ended far too soon, his legacy, shaped by truth rather than myth, is more powerful, more moving, and more human than ever before.